Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. Today we are talking high intensity training. By that I mean severe intensity domain. If you're talking about a domain model, if you're talking about my zone system, we're talking about zone 4 and zone 5. I think if we're talking about Owain's system, we're using zone 5. But basically, above threshold up to VO2 max is what we're talking about today. And this is just a continuation of the zone series that we've been working on over the last few weeks and going through. So we've done zone 2, zone 3, and now we're up into zone 4 and zone 5, or heavy severe intensity domain, which is probably the area where the most amount of scientific research is, because HIIT training, high intensity training, is super popular, it's really effective, and it's very easy to study because you get a big response very quickly. So just like the other parts of this series, the aim of today is to explain and define what severe intensity domain training is, how you identify those zones, both in the field and in a lab, and also what adaptations you'd expect to get from that training, and also the limitations to fitting that training into your week and how you can go about structuring it, and just the disadvantages, I guess, of doing really high intensity training. So that's what we're going to cover today, or hopefully cover today. Does that sound all right, Owain? Does that sound like what we've planned?
Yeah, it does. And I'd agree. Yeah, it's well researched, isn't it? Like that was definitely, we jumped on, started talking, and I said there's way more here than there is about about the heavy domain. Like you say, I guess we always tend to view it through the lens of running, and when you look at the intensity distribution, it's the least amount of training that we would do, but in sort of wider populations as well. Yeah, like you said, HIIT training, circuit classes are really, really popular, and understanding those and the impact they have is really useful. And when you're talking about like general population that doesn't exercise, like this is often the sort of, what does HIIT training do to an untrained population? Is quite a common study, I'd say, more common than what does zone 2 do to a untrained population, certainly at this point. So there's a lot out there.
Exactly. And I think you're looking at this through your threshold bias, though, when with some of those comments you're saying there. I think if you went down to, you're talking about HIIT classes and circuit training. I think if you went down to a typical track club session any night of the year, most people are doing severe intensity domain training. It might not supposed to be severe intensity domain training. It might supposed to be, the intention might be to do threshold training, but often I think if people are not thinking too much about the type of sessions they're doing, I think the tradition, certainly in the UK, is you go to the track or you go to the local industrial estate, and you're doing reasonably short reps, quite hard, and you want to get to the end feeling like you've achieved something, and you're probably not quite a 10 out of 10 effort, but you're an 8 or 9 out of 10, certainly by the last rep. So I actually think this is quite descriptive of what a lot of people are doing. I'm not saying that's wrong. I think a lot of people obviously get a lot of benefits from doing that sort of work, but then long term, is that the best approach? And that's, I guess, goes back to our last episode on zone 3 and threshold based training, which you can go and take a listen to if you haven't already done that. So I don't think it's uncommon. I think if you especially go to a junior club and they go into the track and they're doing 10 400s off a minute, or you're prepping for a 5K, so you do 5 by a K off 90 seconds or 2 minutes rest, pretty much as hard as you can, maybe a touch in reserve.
Then you call it tempo on Strava afterwards. That's the
Then you call it tempo.
Parkrun tempo, and you've done a smash fest for the entirety of parkrun.
Exactly. So before we get into that, do you want to tell us a bit about Patreon? I was going to say about SOAR. SOAR, what's going on in the land of SOAR?
Yeah, so new things with SOAR. So there's the X Trail series. So a lot of the stuff, like the race shorts we have, are like X Race. But there's some X Trail stuff, which is just combining the trail gear. So we've got like the shorts and the top, right? The trail race shorts and top. So definitely worth checking out, especially you might want to go on the trails when the weather maybe improves a bit. It's pretty grim here at the moment. I don't know if the trails even exist around by you. They might be underwater, but
My trails are great. They just drain really well because it's so steep, the hills. Water just washes off them. It's great. Not that I venture on very much, but I've also my gravel bike up there. Yes, on Monday, and great actually. Yeah, I even took up some of the mountain bike trails and feared for my life, but I did get through it unscathed on my slick little tires. But yeah, I do love that Saw Trail kit. The shorts are great. Just extra like cargo storage, and you just get so many gels in there. I quite like the fact that they're all on the front. They're just easy to get to rather than going into your back pocket to try and get the gels out. And then the t-shirt looks super cool as well. White trail top though, I don't think I would dare take it on the trails. That's my only concern, but I wear it just day to day, and it's great.
Yeah, it is really nice. And we said when we got it, right, like there's just these little details that are really cool about it, like the sort of collar so that your hydration pack doesn't rub on your neck, because I've definitely had that in trail races before. Is like, nice little touches, and then how the paneling's designed to fit around a pack as well, to sort of work best to keep your temperature down, because you get a bit hotter when you're wearing a pack, but then also not wear out because you're wearing that pack. It's
Exactly.
really cool. I've seen that kit.
Yeah, I've done trail races which were, well, I've done one trail race which was like 6 hours long, and it completely just, the amount of friction going through your back and your pack and the kit is crazy, especially when you're sweaty, you're salty. Or in the UK, you've been rained on for hours. It does really make a difference having good kit. So yeah, go and check out Saw. I jumped ahead, but let's now talk about Patreon. So if you want to hear a bit more about us and you want to get to know myself, Owain, and Jenny Nesbitt, Commonwealth Games 5K and 10K athlete, and hear about our training and how we're applying some of the knowledge that we impart to you people on a weekly basis, then go check us out on Patreon. And we've an extra episode per week, early access to content. So we try and get this show out to Patreon subscribers a day early, and you can interact with us in the comments as well, ask us questions about the show, and really shape how the podcast, the direction it goes, and what we should cover in different episodes as well. So if you want to go and check Patreon out, go follow the link in the show notes. We've got a couple of Patrons to thank. Owain, do you want to kick us off? Who are we thanking first?
Yeah, so we are thanking Atef. I actually know Atef. I've met him a couple of times. Did a race together in Sweden, which is pretty cool. He is talking about Saw. He is a fashionable guy when it comes to running kit. I was I paled in comparison. There's a photo of me and him at the end of this trail race. Cheers, Atef in Paris, for the support.
And I'm going to thank James Flett. I know less about James, I'm afraid, but London-based, looking at his Strava, regular visitor to Battersea Park. As are quite a few of the athletes I coach, and I think everybody in the south of London seems to be venturing to Battersea Park to do their session. Such a good training location there. So thank you very much for your support, James. Really appreciate it. And if you want to hear more about Patreon or find out a bit more, you can see a description and a link in the show notes. So shall we get on to the topic of today? Shall we just start with defining the severe intensity domain? And I guess we need to just recap a little bit in terms of what do we mean by intensity domains. So this is how scientists think about different intensities, and they break these intensity domains or intensity zones up using quite specific physiological anchor points. So he talks about the moderate intensity domain, which is where your zone 2 sits, and that's below your first lactate threshold. We've then got the heavy domain, which was our episode that launched or released last week, which is that threshold intensity. So between LT1 and LT2, an intensity where you'd run and lactate is going to be elevated, but it would stabilize over the course of a run. And in terms of like race intensities, that's going to be somewhere between marathon pace, half marathon pace, up to, depending on how fit you are and what time you're going to run for different distances. I'd say that LT2 is sort of an intensity you could sustain for roughly an hour, give or take. I'd say a bit more, a bit less, dependent upon who you are, how resilient you are, how good your durability is, but that sort of ballpark. Today, we're talking about the severe intensity domain, which is above LT2 if you're using lactate. We've also talked about critical speed as another way, which is often used to define the bottom of a severe intensity domain. There's quite a lot of variability in terms of the thresholds that we can use. I've said at the start of this, there's a more of a consensus on how to break these up versus like training zones, which are very dynamic, very individual. People can use their own model. There's no set agreed upon model. There's 3-zone models, 5-zone models, 6-zone models, 7-zone models. And even myself and Owain, who are very much on the same page, use slightly different systems because of just how we think best to apply those zones. But severe intensity domain, above that threshold, but that is so the LT2, critical speed, ventilatory threshold 2, that is the lower boundary. So we're talking about going up to above that threshold where things are sustainable. And then the top cap is VO2 max effectively, or speed at VO2 max, intensity at VO2 max, which is not very well defined. I think the best way to think about the top is intensities where you would fatigue before you get to VO2 max. So if you're thinking about running, you're thinking about the 400 meters where you're absolutely destroyed at the end of a 400 meter race. If you've ever run one, I've done a few in my life and I'm very bad at them. But at the end of a 400 meters, you couldn't move another step. You are completely gone. But you're not at VO2 max at the end. So that would be in a different intensity domain, the extreme intensity domain. I'd say 800 meters, like when you're about 2 or 3 minutes, that's typically what's thought of, I would say, in more practical terms, at the top of that, the top of the severe intensity domain. But actually, you often see time trials that are predictive of the speed at VO2 max, and that's more like 5 to 6 minutes in duration. So it's a bit of a blurry line. I think at the end of an 800 meter race, you're probably going to be at VO2 max. At the end of a 400 meter race, you're not. So somewhere in that window, and again, not as easily defined in terms of an intensity, but that's the window we're looking at in terms of zones.
Yeah, and I guess the interest in the severe domain, apart from like the practical uses, that I guess like a very easy way of sort of discussing it is that everything is unstable. In terms of your metabolic and physiological response, which, like you said at the start, is quite interesting for measuring it, isn't it? Like, you could have someone on the treadmill for an hour, and a lot of the measurable things are going to stay fairly similar. Whereas, across a 8-minute bout, like it's going to completely change once you're into the severe intensity domain. Which, like we said, is interesting to measure, and then you can, have like deeper interventions in terms of how you then divide up that time. That's where like velocity at VO2 max comes in, doesn't it? And research about how much work at VVO2 max can you do, and generally you can do a bit more than it takes to normally attain VO2 max. That's kind of interesting, and that poses more questions about what's actually going on physiologically. So I guess from that perspective, it's quite interesting because everything sort of changes quite quick.
Exactly. And I think that's the main differentiator between, or is the primary differentiator between the severe intensity domain and the heavy intensity domain. If you're racing a half marathon, lactate is going to have to be quite stable, because if it was just drifting upwards continuously, you're not going to be able to be out there for 60, 70, 80, 90 plus minutes. So it's not saying it's completely stable, but there's going to be a quasi steady state where lactate is, and other fatigue markers are drifting, but only quite slowly. Whereas if you contrast that to a 3K race, for example, which I like a 3K, especially indoors. I don't know why. I've always found it fun. But it's a completely different pain. I think my PB is 8 minutes, 18 seconds. if you'd gone to the track and measured my lactate every minute or every lap, then lactate would not be stabilizing. Every lap I'd come in, my lactate would be a bit higher, a bit higher, a bit higher, because we are really so far above our threshold that it is not a speed that's sustainable anymore. And we're really having to tap into that glycolytic anaerobic capacity to release the energy we need at a great enough rate. So it's just not, we're not going to see a stabilization in your lactate response. And I'm talking about lactate here, you could look at oxygen consumption, you could look at heart rate, nothing is going to be stable. And you can tell that just by that sense of effort. It's going to be quite hard at the start, but it's going to drift very, very quickly. And by the end, a speed that felt quite all right for the first lap is definitely not all right anymore. And you're doing everything you can just to maintain intensity. So that is like the primary differentiator, is that this level of stability that you get when you are below your LT2 or second threshold versus above it. And the further you are above that threshold, the more unstable you're going to be.
Yeah, which is where it's interesting, and like we said at the start as well, where a lot of people end up training as well, and I guess I don't know if that necessarily was sort of speaking negatively of being above LT2. Like, there's obviously a lot of I don't know, it's very simple. A lot of things going on that aren't necessarily happening if you're below. But then also in terms of and maybe where we want to start in terms of the sort of dose and response from training above LT2, it's also quite interesting, right? And we sort of talked about this, especially in the episode about zone 2. But if you're looking at like what training input can I make to get a response, in terms of like the magnitude of response, like training at this intensity is good. I guess a good way to sort of get a better response. And that's partly why it's well researched as well.
100%, 100%. I think I hopefully now got an idea of what intensity that looks like, both from a physiological but also just in a practical sense. I would say like 10k pace, 5k pace, 1500, 3k pace, 1500 meter pace. Maybe 1500 meters is sort of that divider. You go a bit shorter, and now you're sort of on that boundary between severe and extreme intensity domain. Of course, it's going to depend upon how quick you are. I'd say even the difference between world-class men running 141 for 800, 140 for 800, and world-class women, Keely Hodgkinson, running 154. At those intensities, running for an extra 14 seconds, 15 seconds makes quite a big difference in terms of the energy demands. And again, like just dropping from 8 to 15 makes quite a big difference because of this relationship, this exponential relationship we get with intensity and duration, in that actually the drop off in speed is quite significant. And that's the whole critical speed model, which we'll get to on another episode. I think we've already decided we want to do a whole episode on critical speed and that model in a bit more detail. But hopefully now you've got this understanding. But that's the sort of event distances we're talking about in terms of intensity, and also what we'd expect to see physiologically is a complete non-steady state, but we're seeing big drifts in things like VO2. And let's now dive into that physiological response in a bit more detail. So do you want to start this off, Owain, or should I keep going?
No, I'm happy to. Yeah. So I guess we sort of alluded to it in terms of like the end state is reaching VO2 max. So once you're into this intensity domain, oxygen uptake is going to keep rising. I guess we've also maybe we'll get onto it, but like we talked about, like especially in the heavy domain, where like you can use heart rate to sort of see like, okay, is my heart rate stable across an effort or across multiple efforts? And yeah, it's going to be fairly stable if you're in the heavy domain. Whereas if you're in the severe domain, like, you're just going to see your heart rate rise. If you're doing that, 10 by 400 session, you're probably going to see your heart rate rise across the session in the same way that you're going to see your like oxygen uptake rising across the session, even with the recoveries. And that's sort of, yeah, typical of this intensity domain, that the demand is just sort of continuously rising across the session. And then in addition to that as well, the sort of I guess like metabolic muscle metabolite response to the intensity as well is I guess quite different to the other domains. So yeah, you've mentioned lactate, and as always with lactate, like, it is one byproduct, but it's also like an inference of what else is going on at the muscle that you can't necessarily measure. So yeah, like, you're going to have a lot more sort of muscle metabolite production, and a change in like pH in the muscle as well.
Yeah, you're going to get massive acidification levels within the muscle as much as your body will allow. And that's definitely going to be one of the main fatigue drivers in this intensity domain. And that's one of the other things that I meant to mention on the last episode. I'm talking about zone 3 and threshold. Like, when you're in that space, there's two fatigue mechanisms primarily when you're talking about threshold training, heavy intensity domain training. And that is, you're either going to run out of muscle glycogen, or your durability is insufficient enough that you're eventually just going to drift out of that heavy intensity domain and go into the severe intensity domain. Because although you're in a steady state, it's a sort of quasi-steady state. And obviously your economy is going to get worse over the context of a marathon, for example, and a speed that once was below your LT2 is not going to be below your LT2 when you're 30, 35, 40K deep into a marathon. So there are two fatigue mechanisms there. Whereas in the severe intensity domain, it is this metabolic response that is ultimately going to limit you. And the fact that your oxygen consumption is just drifting up towards max. And I think that's a misunderstanding. People talk about speed at VO2 max, and we've mentioned it already on this podcast, but it's a bit of a loose term and not well that defined. And that is because as soon as you are above your LT2, if you hold that intensity or that speed for long enough, not that intensity, that speed for long enough, your oxygen consumption will drift up to VO2 max. And if it's in a 10K, that's going to take you a bit longer. If it's a 3K, it's going to take you not as long. But eventually you'll get to VO2 max. And once you've got to VO2 max, there's not many places you can go in terms of getting your energy from. You've got your anaerobic system, your glycolytic system, which is already working in partnership as soon as you go past your LT2. But eventually that will tap out and you just can't release energy at a quick enough rate to meet the demands and to resynthesize ATP, which is the universal energy currency of the cell, but also our muscle fibers. And that is ultimately what's going to cause that fatigue, in combined with acidification of your muscles, which is eventually going to just prevent muscle contraction at a peripheral level. So they're quite different fatigue mechanisms. You're not going to be fatigued because you've run out of glycogen. You're going to be fatigued because of this drift upwards in your energy costs and that metabolic stress on the system.
I think also, it's the same across all intensity domains, but it's not just one thing that's causing the fatigue or that's going on. Like, one of the papers that we'll link them in the show notes, but one was talking about how the O2 demand at the muscle is so high when you're in the severe domain that you'll recruit type 2 fibers, which you're going to be doing to meet that metabolic demand, and that then drives the oxygen cost. And sort of almost, I guess in my head I've always thought like it's like a cascade, but actually like that's happening, and that's going to influence like the sort of muscle metabolite response as well. There's like a lot going on at the same time that then contributes to this the sort of, I guess, like end state that you see through like a lactate measurement or through like in research a blood sample, and it's I guess it's it's hard to quantify, because how do you measure like an individual muscle's oxygen cost? Like you can't really do that in humans. But yeah, there's I guess, so I maybe butchered it a bit, but there's just so much going on sort of at a muscular level, and it's maybe not actually clearly known sort of like what comes first, and there's like a bit of feed forward, feedback in terms of how your body is responding to the intensity demand.
Absolutely. There's just so much stress in the system. And again, like things aren't stable. They're very dynamic when you're in this intensity domain. And you're going to, and it's not just as clear cut as, oxygen consumption is drifting up. Obviously, like you said, there's increased muscle fiber recruitment, fast twitch muscle fibers are more intensively used, or more extensively used, sorry. By the end, when you're at failure, you're going to be using almost all of your muscle fibers just to maintain force output. And also each of those fibers is becoming less efficient, less economical as you transition through that 3K race, for example, because of just of a buildup of metabolites, and that we're using increasingly glycolytic sources for energy, which is going to just pump up that oxygen demand as well. So lots of stuff going on. I'm just looking through. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say then, do we want to sort of talk about some of the, I guess, like signaling responses once the bat's finished, once you've reached fatigue, once you've blown up in your 10x400 rep or interval session?
Yeah, well, I think one of the important notes before we jump into that is that in your training sessions, you don't need to finish at complete exhaustion to be in this domain. Although you're going to be working pretty hard, obviously. But as an RPE guide, I'm going like an 8 or 9 out of 10. I'm not going 10 out of 10, because save that for race day. And you can still get quite a lot of work done by good speeds by capping yourself at 9 out of 10. But as you've said, Owain, all those physiological responses are going to drive cellular signaling, which is ultimately how we get fitter. So there is a response of the body, which you've just defined in terms of that VO2 response, metabolic response. That is going to then drive a cellular signaling process that ultimately translates into protein synthesis of specific proteins that are going to help you generate a body that is better suited, more well-adjusted, well-adapted for endurance exercise, high-intensity exercise, moderate-intensity exercise, whatever. Like, as we said last time, there's a big overlap. It's not just as clear-cut as moderate intensity does this and high intensity does that. But this protein synthesis, for example, building new mitochondria, more efficient mitochondria with higher enzyme contents, computerization, that is basically the pathway from physiological stress, cellular signaling, and then protein synthesis, and then training adaptations, which you could measure in the form of doing a submaximal test and seeing an improved LT1, LT2. But we'll dive into a bit of detail around the cellular signaling. It's very easy to just get lost in the weeds, but for some people, this will be super interesting if you're a massive nerd like myself. If you're less of a nerd, then hopefully you can still follow along what we're talking about, because we're not specialists in this area, and you can just keep going and going into more and more detail in terms of the precise signaling pathway. Like even like oxidative phosphorylation or glycolysis, for example, has got 9 or 10 steps and just as many enzymes that are catalyzing those reactions. Do you want to choose one to take, or should I kick us off here, Owain?
Yeah, why didn't you start? I think you're probably a bit better at this than me.
Yeah, okay. So I guess one of the first probably the primary signaling pathway that we get with high intensity training, especially, but also with my moderate and heavy intensity domain training, is that we see a depletion of ATP stores within the muscle. And by ATP is the universal energy currency of the cell. As every textbook says, and I've already said on a podcast already, but basically that is what is going to drive muscle contraction. And it's the splitting of ATP into two molecules, AMP and ADP. which basically ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, so 3-phosphate ions, whereas AMP and ADP are adenosine monophosphate and adenosine diphosphate. So you're basically splitting ATP into 2 different molecules, one which has got 1 phosphate and one that has got 2 phosphates. And that process releases energy that can be used for basically anything, but in this instance, we're talking about muscle contraction. Now, we then need to break down fats and carbohydrates to regenerate that ATP. That's how we're generating ATP, by either aerobic means or by anaerobic means using glycolysis. And that is super important, because if we can't keep up that rate of ATP generation, our muscles are just going to stop working. And again, we're talking about muscles here, but if we don't generate ATP at a quick enough rate, even at rest, that's when you die. So really important that this process keeps going. We've got so many mechanisms that are going to defend against this breakdown of this ATP regeneration cycle. But in severe intensity domain training, we are really challenging this turnover of ATP. And so what we tend to, as what we see is that in the heavy intensity domain, for example, we are seeing an equilibrium between ATP generation and ATP breakdown, so that the levels remain pretty constant. Whereas in the severe intensity domain, we start getting this shift between to less ATP and more of this AMP and ADP accumulation. And this mismatch is a really important signaling process, because, as I've said already, we really want to defend this pathway. If we're not generating ATP quick enough, that is going to cause a lot of damage long term. So our body then thinks, right, we need to get better at generating ATP, and that activates this AMPK signaling pathway, which I don't even know what that stands for. I'm not going to pretend that I can remember what that stands for right off the top of my head. But basically, that is going to drive a cascade of training adaptations, which will help the body be in a better place to meet the ATP demands next time we're put in a stressful situation, or next time we're working in the severe intensity domain. So the greater the intensity, the more the AMP and ADP we accumulate relative to ATP, and that is going to drive an increased AMPK response, which, as I've said, is going to be the main driver of training adaptations in this intensity domain. So downstream, we're going to get an upregulation of PGC1 alpha, which increases mitochondrial biogenesis. We've talked a lot about that on previous podcasts already. So that's super important for things like our thresholds, for example. Again, if we can release energy from oxidative means quicker, then we're going to have higher thresholds effectively. But also things like our ability to transport glucose across the cell, the ability to process fatty acids as well, which comes with just increased mitochondrial content. And also not just more mitochondria, but better mitochondria with higher enzyme contents that are able to turn over more ATP more quickly. So that is one of the massive markers there, which is this loss of or reduction in the ATP levels within the muscle fibers really drives up this AMPK pathway. So that's one part of it. We've then got the second response, which is the fact that this intensity is really, really high and basically produces lots of waste products, like you were just talking about earlier, Owain. So reactive oxygen species, which are free radicals, these things that like vitamin C is supposed to target. This is just like a byproduct of aerobic metabolism. So if our metabolism is going at a normal rate, we're producing some reactive oxygen species, which are ultimately cause some damage if get to too high levels. But when we're working really hard, we're just flooding the body with a much greater rate of reactive oxygen species, in which case that can cause damage if there's excessive, but it's also a really important signaling pathway for, again, things like PGC1 alpha. So this is probably in the bracket of waste product generation and reactive oxygen species, free radicals, potentially mechanical stress as well, which can really induce quite significant training adaptations. And this is something you don't really see in the heavy domain and the moderate domain because we don't see the same rate of metabolic disturbances. But it is something we see in extreme intensity domain, so like 400-meter pace stuff. This is where you're getting a lot of those aerobic adaptations from sprint interval training, for example.
I was gonna jump in and say, I think it's especially like looking, going back to the Zone 2 podcast, and so one of the arguments, which I don't think is clear the answer at the moment, but is about PGC1 alpha, and then also like calcium signaling, and how they both sort of work to induce that mitochondrial sort of biogenesis. And I think the very, very simplistic view, which I'm not sure is right, is that like Zone 2 training sort of saturates that calcium signaling pathway, and then you only get that PGC1 alpha response when you do high intensity exercise. And I think actually, especially the like Much Ado About Zone 2, right? I get the paper title right. I think that's one of their sort of actually main parts of the paper, is talking about how it's not really clear either way, and that's just like a very simplistic view. But I think that might be where people have heard of like PGC1 alpha, especially that sort of, you can read some I guess like explanations of it that do paint it like very black and white, of like you do one signaling with this method of training, one with another, and that's not the case. I guess, as we'll come on to in terms of how to use like this training zone and sort of, or this training intensity and all of them. And then the other thing I was going to say was like the reactive oxygen species and sort of oxidative stress, right? Because I guess that's where this crosses over from like exercise training and not just exercise training, but like what's the right word? Like trying to like refine and do the best exercise training you can, but it sort of crosses over into like health and well-being, because you also generate those when you're unwell or when you have infections or diseases. And there's also just like you get like antioxidative food, and that's sort of quite a big push, and like reducing inflammation, and actually you do need some of that to sort of help, I guess, I don't know, help the signaling or put the body in the right what's the right word, right state to induce like training adaptations as well. So there's a bit of I guess some amount of those reactive oxygen species are good, but then too many, and maybe that's where we're going to get onto like what happens if you do too much of this training. But yeah, it's quite an interesting crossover, isn't it, where it goes from someone trying to improve their 5K to actually this stuff comes up in terms of like disease treatment as well, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And I think this is where like the saying goes, isn't it? The poison is in the dose. So a bit of something like reactive oxygen species, good, drives physiological adaptation. Too much, overloads the system, and that's when it's going to really wreak havoc and cause pathogenesis and pathology. So yeah, definitely with all of these things, it's actually thinking about not just what it does, but in what level and what degree are you stressing the body. So that is the last one I was going to talk about was this idea of when you are in this domain, of course, you're operating at near VO2 max, you're driving, you're still deriving most of your energy from aerobic means. But in parallel, you are having to progressively recruit more fast twitch muscle fibers and use more of your glycolytic or anaerobic energy system to fuel the energy rate you need, because your economy is just getting worse and worse. And so you are depleting that D prime. If you remember back to that critical speed and D prime model we've talked about before, and that means that we are tapping into this glycolytic system, which is going to again lead to glycolytic adaptations as well. So when you're doing this type of training, you do there's a pathway called HIF1 alpha, which stands for hypoxic inducible factor 1 alpha, and that is basically driving some of these more anaerobic adaptations. So increasing the amount of glycolytic enzymes we have in the body. So we actually can have greater rates of energy release from glycolysis. We also induce increases in lactate transporters as well. So actually we are better at getting lactate out of the muscles and into the blood, because counterintuitively, it's better to have it in the blood than the muscles. In the muscles, it can't do that much. If we're transporting it around the body, then we can use it as a fuel source. And the same with the hydrogen ions associated with it. So if we can increase our ability to work anaerobically, then that is going to translate into being able to sustain these intensities for longer, which is obviously going to be beneficial. We also get adaptations which allow us to actually just tolerate acidity levels to a greater extent. So we've got a natural bicarbonate buffer in our blood. Everyone's taking bicarb these days. Not me, it doesn't get on with me, but a lot of people are taking bicarb these days. But we have a natural system that enables us to buffer acidity within the blood and within the muscles. And so naturally, if we expose our body to those high intensity training where we're generating lots of lactate and the associated hydrogen ions, then we're going to be able to be in a better place to cope with those going forward. So it's you can see it gets very complicated very quickly, but I think one of the key messages we wanted to get across is there is actually a lot of overlap. And like you said, Owain, we can see mitochondrial biogenesis and upregulation of PGC1 alpha through moderate intensity training, and from high intensity training, we're just going about it in slightly different ways. AMP, ADP accumulation seems to be really important for high intensity stuff. Calcium signaling from just continually contracting our muscles for long durations is the driver when it comes to moderate intensity domain. And then we've got heavy intensity domain in the middle, which is probably doing a bit of both. And again, we've said this on the episode last week, much less evidence and research in that space in terms of driving or increasing our understanding of what is really driving adaptation there. But it's probably best thought of as a spectrum rather than discrete, right? You're going to get the X from Y, you're going to get VO2 max training, VO2 max adaptations from high intensity work, and moderate intensity work is just going to improve your fat oxidation rates. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, even back in the Zone 2 episode, like doing some of that research and seeing discussion about how potentially like muscle glycogen levels can drive like different responses to Zone 2 training. So there's the sort of training, the discrete training and the potential physiological outcome it drives, but then there's also how that fits in to a normal athlete sort of existence as such. Like we're probably all like somewhat like glycogen depleted if you're doing a lot of training. So that's going to be slightly different to someone in a study. And, we always come back to how studies are done. Generally, they don't look like what a normal runner's training looks like because you're just trying to completely isolate one variable. So how this fits in, and then how this signaling actually occurs as part of a normal training week where you have quite a lot of Zone 2 and you maybe have, then an amount of heavy intensity domain and then a little bit of this, how that actually manifests itself, and then how that manifests itself across multiple weeks can sort of vary greatly, right? I guess we talk about these things discretely, but actually, the way they manifest in real life is potentially a bit different.
Yeah, like you said, there's so many interacting effects, and it's not just to do with what you're doing in training, it's what's going on outside of training that's going to influence that translation from stress to cellular signaling to adaptation and protein synthesis, etc. So there's a lot of moving parts, which makes doing really applied work challenging. But I think this is what we said at the start. This is probably the most researched exercise intensity domain because it's so potent. Right? We get really good responses really quickly. And we said in the last podcast that there seems to be a dose response relationship between intensity and training adaptation for pretty much every variable, whether it be VO2 max, thresholds, mitochondrial oxidation, capacity, etc. But importantly, that is per unit of time. So 1 minute of heavy intensity, 1 minute of severe intensity domain training is better than 1 minute of heavy intensity domain training versus 1 minute of moderate intensity domain training. But that's
Yeah.
not how it works in real life, is it?
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I think we're both at the same place. Like, I think I just want to read the quote. We'll put the link to this paper down below. But yeah, from McInnes et al. In 2019. So they sort of said near the end, we contend that intensity is the most important variable mediating exercise-induced increases in mitochondrial content in human skeletal muscle within a fixed period of time. And I think then I added a note underneath saying that I think a lot of people miss the mediating part. I think people think, okay, this is the most important. Like, so I've got to do, more is better, but it's the most important variable mediating the changes. And I think that's really important in terms of, it's important to do exercise in this intensity domain, but it's, how much of it do you actually do? How much, it's more time efficient, but when do you actually sort of run out of the benefits, and when is it potentially actually almost I don't want to say a maladaptive use of your time, but like maybe for long-term sustainability, it's more important to do other training, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. I think the other important part of that quote is the fixed time period, or the fixed period of time part, where actually I think it's people intuitively know that, right, if I need to get fitter in 4 weeks, I'm not thinking about intensity control too much. I'm going, right, what is the maximum amount of work I can do in 4 weeks? And we've all been in that position, right? I've got a race in 3 weeks, 4 weeks coming up. What am I going to do for my hard sessions? Well, I'm going to work pretty hard there. And I'm actually, even if I start out at threshold intensity and I'm doing quite a big session, I really just want to work as hard as I can for that session, because intuitively, for no pain, no gain, to an extent, makes sense. Right? The harder we work, the more physiological response we will get. But it's when you start talking about months to years of time frame, rather than just we've got a few days to get fit, that sometimes, or actually I would say most of the time, just going hard all the time is not going to pay off for you because of these other factors, which we're going to talk about now, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess So moving on to the sort of adaptations. I guess they sort of cascade from the signaling, right? So you're gonna produce more of the lactate transporters that are able to move lactate from your skeletal muscle into your blood, which is going to allow you to, I guess, I don't want to say buffer, because that sort of brings to mind like, bicarb and how that works, but you're going to be able to work at maybe a slightly higher rate or tolerate a slightly higher, I guess, like metabolic output over time. It is going to enhance your aerobic and potentially your anaerobic capacity as well. Being able to tolerate that metabolic state from the anaerobic exercise is going to improve that anaerobic capacity. But also generally seems to improve your aerobic fitness as well. I guess I would say some of that comes from looking at untrained populations. They tend to see quite an improvement in everything from doing higher intensity training. Maybe you wouldn't quite see that in Dan that's been training for 20 years. So I guess the responses are maybe mediated based on your training history.
Yeah, definitely. I think the question comes then, like, how much intensity can you put into your program? The science says more intensity is better, but to what extent, because we also look at what elite athletes are doing, and very few people, I would say almost no pros that I know of, are having more than 3 hard days a week. They might be having multiple hard sessions within those days, but if you're looking at a Jakob or a double thresholder, they might have 2 hard sessions on one day, but they're not going hard Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, which, if you take the literature at face value that more intensity is better, then you could see how you could fall into that trap. But athletes are not stupid. They know what works and what doesn't, especially this generation over time, this evolution of training processes. And I don't think, as I said, people aren't doing 4, 5, 6 days a week of intense training. They're at max doing 3 and normally spacing them out. So that if you're doing 3, you go in Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. You're not going Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. There are going to be always going to be a few outliers. But I'd like to hear if you know of people who are doing that sort of training, because that's really interesting. I'm sure there are people out there who are experimenting, but the consensus that athletes have found seems to be that 2 or 3 hard days seems to be optimal. But why is that? Why do you think?
Yeah, I guess I was gonna mention this paper in a second anyway, but there's quite a nice paper looking at the dose per week of these hard training sessions. There's quite a lot of work by Bilat, I think I'm getting the name right. There's quite a lot of work by them on VO2 max training, or severe intensity training. And they had runners do 4 weeks of 1 session a week at VVO2 max, and then they did 4 weeks of 3 sessions a week at VVO2 max. And they found once they went to the 3 sessions a week, they didn't actually improve any performance measures. They didn't decrease either, but the sort of subjective reports were all negative. There wasn't any benefit, but the athletes had higher fatigue, higher muscle soreness, worse sleep quality, which are all maybe things that you would, that maybe are sort of linked to things like an increase in reactive oxygen species, right? Or like that would be maybe the response if you were ill, but actually this is the response to training, and training too much, and maybe putting your body in sort of physiological state from doing these high intensity sessions. And that was only a sort of 4-week protocol, with some decently well-trained athletes that, so they're not getting any performance benefit, and their sort of quality of life is suffering. And I think that sort of speaks to, where there's I guess a line that will vary by individual based on their life, but also changes over time as well. This is maybe one of the things we were discussing just before we came on was, maybe for a couple of weeks, 3 sessions a week works, but actually after a couple of weeks, you might reduce it to 2 and then to 1. And that's probably where a lot of really well-trained people are, that actually they don't quite, you see the studies where they have people do 3 or 4 sessions a week, but they're starting from, a lot of these studies are starting from untrained populations. So maybe you can just hit someone with loads of high intensity training, but then at a certain point, the sort of signaling pathway and the sort of cascade from that is saturated, and you actually need less. And that's not very well studied, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area of where research is going, and there's definitely a trend towards looking at not just what are we giving the athletes in terms of a dose for training sessions, but how we structure that over a few months. So things like this block periodization, where we're going to hit someone really hard for a week. So we're going to do 5 hard sessions, and then we're going to do a week where we only do 1. And they're going to recover, and they're not going to become overtrained because they've only done it for a week. And then we're going to try and hit them again with another 5 hard sessions in 7 days and allow them to recover. And is that more optimal than spreading the dose out evenly? So you're doing 2 to 3 sessions a week every week. And I think when you get to a certain level, maybe you need that extra stimulus to really keep driving adaptations. I don't think that's where you should be starting from. I think you should start with good good sustainable training, and that is where this severe intensity domain has its downside, is that the stress is very large on your body. You can't, if you can't do it every day. Just intuitively, you know that you're sore after a club night, or you're tired, you're fatigued. You can feel it in your legs, and the thought of going to do that again the next day and again the day after would be pretty traumatizing, I imagine, just like the participants in that study. Uh, and it's not just the fact that you are producing, lots of fatigue. You're having like really high metabolic stress. It's also you are stressing your muscles to a high extent as well. Like there's a neuromuscular factor there, and it's not just the risk of overtraining. I'd say it's the risk of injury as well, all combined. We all know that the faster you run, the more likely you are to get injured. And you got sprinters who hardly do any volume, but they're injured 50% of the time. They've put in their hamstrings, they're snapping their Achilles, this, that, and whatever. And it's not a volume question there, it's an intensity. So intensity is really potent for driving training adaptations, but also high risk in terms of the risk of overtraining and the risk of injury as well. So that is where the balance falls, I think.
Yeah, and I guess like, so we sort of always try and do like linking in some of the other like episodes we've done, and like if you think about like performance planning and you say like, okay, when do I want my sort of, 2 or 3 races a year where you want your best performances, and you're going to tape it into them and target them. And yeah, maybe if it's a marathon, like this becomes less relevant as well, because it's so far, it's such a higher like work rate than you're ever going to be sort of operating at in a marathon. Hopefully you're not in the severe domain during a marathon. Maybe the
Maybe by
last
the
200
end,
meters.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
But you decide, okay, well, if 3 sessions a week is just leading to fatigue and eventually a loss of training, then it's just 1 session a week, and you save that sort of final push for a couple of weeks out. I think we've talked about this on the podcast. We definitely talked about it in person. Like, I think for both of us, like training for a 5K or 10K would probably still be a lot of heavy intensity domain work, and then a sprinkling of severe intensity domain. But especially in the last like 2 to 3 weeks, that would be like, we might slightly vary in terms of how much we would do it before, but those last 2 to 3 weeks would both definitely in agreement, right? That like, yeah, you would want to really push a few of those sessions, and that's where you're sort of going into this intensity domain and really driving those responses. And then the race is done, and then okay, you go back to mostly heavy domain training, and that's although we don't necessarily know what's happening during the competition period, but that seems to be how like the Ingebrigtsens train is year round. It's basically one of these sessions a week, isn't it? It's like it's Saturday hills, which, I mean, with them arguably is probably barely sort of getting into this intensity domain, and then that's a lot of the year's training. And then when it comes to the competition phase, they actually have the 15s and 5Ks that Jakob is running, but then there is other sort of higher intensity training happening in that competition phase. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what they're doing. Maybe one of them wants to come on and tell us what they're doing during that competition phase. I'm sure there's a bit more, and especially in the build up to the bigger races, I'm sure they're doing some really intense sessions, but they're not doing it year round. That's once a week, some hills.
Yeah, I think they're touching that intensity year round, but then my understanding is they are doing some pretty hard stuff in that block. And I think one of the interesting things that I've seen recently is from Algarin, the Swede, who's broken the European 10K record. He was third at the Olympics in the 10K. Pretty sure he's third, wasn't he? Behind Grissier, and then the Kenyan, his name is gone now, the long-limbed Kenyan. But anyway, he's follows this Norwegian threshold, double threshold approach. And he's been on the record as saying you need that stuff, the threshold stuff, but actually doing so much of that training then just allows you to do more hard specific stuff. So of course you're going to get fitness adaptations from doing the threshold work, but the fitter and more conditioned someone is, the more hard stuff you can do when you get to that specific period, which I definitely agree with. Right, I can do so much more high intensity now than I could when I was 16, 17, 18. And then just looking at what what beginners can tolerate or newer runners can tolerate compared to someone who's been in the game for 10, 15 years, it's vastly different. And for example, this was my undoing as well, which comes with a risk of the severe intensity training, so it does come with risk. But a couple of weeks ago, I did 5 by 3K in the morning at a threshold effort, and then I did 3 by a mile, and then 5 by a K in the evening at a harder severe intensity domain effort. And I'm running actually pretty close to 5K race pace for 10K worth of work, having already done 25K of running in the morning with 15K of it at marathon pace. So I wouldn't have been able to do, if I tried to attempt that, I think I got a niggle off the back of it, maybe an injury, probably an injury, but I wouldn't have even been able to start that second session of the day 10 years ago. I just wouldn't have been in a position. I would have been still cooked from the morning session. So definitely training history is going to allow you to tolerate more intensity training, but there's still going to be a limit to it.
Yeah, definitely. And any more from you? I think we've done a bit of a whistle stop tour. I didn't know if you had anything else.
Yeah, I think we can give a bit of a guide about how you should approach these trainings, the sort of training sessions that you do here. Probably more from me, because I have historically done more of them than you, Owain. Maybe is that fair?
Yeah, and I guess I don't know. I get like not to not necessarily like defending myself. I think it's more like I would just rather keep training, right? Like I'd rather err on the side of caution. I would say I think there was other stuff going on, but basically the last time I sort of did these sessions more than once in a blue moon, I sort of ran into some like chronic fatigue issues, and maybe it was this, maybe it wasn't, but I feel like I'd rather just play it a bit safer, and that's meant that I've trained pretty much continuously since then. So I don't know. I guess on one hand, I could be squeezing the orange, is that the right term? A little bit more, but at the same time, like I've been able to continue training. So like, I think I'm probably as far along as I would have been.
Oh no, I think threshold training is the way to go most of the time. And I think I'm talking more about historically as a kid being on a track session with a bunch of teenagers who basically just want to kill each other and run each other into the ground. And I've slightly wised up since then. I don't do that much of this sort of work these days, but I think there's still some guidance that we can give in terms of how you should go about executing these sessions. And I think firstly, it's not thinking about, getting your heart rate as high as you possibly can. And a lot of the literature in terms of VO2 max adaptations say that there is still an interaction between intensity and duration, and there's probably a sweet spot to be had even within the severe intensity domain. So you want to be above 90% of your VO2 max typically. That's where we're seeing greater responses in terms of VO2 max adaptations, because you're driving that cardiovascular system and stressing that cardiovascular system. But actually, if you're working at 100% of VO2 max, then you're just limiting how big a volume session you can do. And if you just drop the intensity down a bit, then you can do quite a lot more work. And for me, when I'm doing these severe intensity domain sessions, I'm not thinking about going any faster than 5K pace. And I'm more thinking about 10K pace as my anchor, because I know that that's a stimulus greater than threshold. I can feel it. I can see my heart rate. If I can measure my lactate, I can see that it's elevated. But I'm not thinking, this is VO2 max pace. I'm getting on the track and running at 1500 meter 3K race pace, because I think then you're shifting the emphasis more to that metabolic stress rather than the cardiovascular stress. And there's, as I said, there's likely this sweet spot where you can get the best of both, where you're getting a good metabolic response but good cardiovascular response too. And for me, that is more 10K pace, maybe up to 5K pace, depending upon the athlete, rather than going, we're racing right at the top of the zone. We're training right at the top of the zone, pushing it all the way down to 1500 meter race pace work. So I think when you're starting these sessions, just have an idea of what you're trying to achieve in mind, and actually how big a volume do you want to achieve and do. I would still be looking to try and get in at least 15 minutes of running, and actually probably closer to 20, 25 minutes of running in these sessions, rather than to go down to track and do about 10, 400 off a minute, which is my not saying it's the worst session of all time, but I think most of the time it is the worst session of all time. You just not getting much out of that. You look at your heart rate response, it's not very high for very long. Yeah, you'll feel awful, but you just haven't actually done that much work. So
we've upset every club in the UK with that.
Maybe, but no, even if you're running them, and even if you're running them in 90 seconds, that's only 15 minutes of work, which is right at the bottom end, I think, of what you want to achieve. And because the reps are so short, the heart rate doesn't get that high, which is definitely part of that response. That is a massive indicator of your oxygen consumption, is your heart rate. So you do want to be working at pretty high intensities from a cardiovascular point, but what's limiting you there is that metabolic cost of running at those speeds. You're just so far above threshold, but you're just generating so much lactate, acidity, waste products, etc., and really decreasing those ATP levels, but very acutely. So I'm not sure if it's the best trade-off. I'm more thinking about doing reps 3 to 5 minutes long, probably at least 2 minutes, and trying to accumulate 15 to 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes of extreme worth of work. And that also means the first couple of reps should feel pretty good. So you're going to see a drift in your heart rate over time, and each set rep is going to get a bit harder. But even at the end, you could do another rep, or you could pick up the pace a little bit. It's not a full 10 out of 10 effort, because then I think you're just wishing, you're just bringing on increasing the chance of something going wrong, whether that be overtraining or injury, etc. So it's hard, but it's not 10 out of 10. I think that would be my primary advice. And think more about trying to get your heart rate above LT2 if you know where that is. And if not, then you can go back to that other go back to other episodes where we've talked about that sort of thing. So last week, the zone 3 stuff. So think about more having a minimum intensity you want to get over rather than a maximum intensity you want to push to. That is all I'm probably going to say about it. But it should be hard, but not so hard that you are a complete mess and broken afterwards.
Yeah, and I guess we sort of mentioned at the start, but like reflect during, observe it during and reflect after. What was your heart rate doing? Especially if you're able to run somewhere where you can fairly tightly control the pace, like at a track. If you know that, you paced the session pretty well because you were at a track and all of the splits were pretty equal, then have a look at what your heart rate's doing. And is it, if you finish and it's staying fairly level the whole way through the session, then you probably weren't much, if at all, above LT2. And you want a bit of a rise. But there's also, I guess, it's going further, straying further from physiology into like coaching, but it's not the end of the world if you go and do it and you weren't quite running hard enough. And okay, next time, if you're at the track, it's 2 seconds a lap quicker, sort of not much difference, versus going way too hard and blowing up 10 minutes in.
Exactly. You should still be prioritizing. You should still be prioritizing getting the session done. That should be the main aim of the session, because even if you work slightly less hard, you're still going to get almost all of the benefits, because we know you can get a great response from working in the heavy intensity domain. So even if you're only just into the severe, you're still going to get a nice stimulus. So I think that's what the first mistake people make is going too hard. But the second mistake people make is not giving themselves enough recovery in between the reps. Because if you want to work at high intensities, you need the rest. And the stimulus isn't going to come from having your heart rate stay a little bit elevated in the recovery by keeping it super short. The stimulus is going to come from being able to get the whole session done. So I think having short rests in threshold sessions is great because it stops people going too hard. But here you want to push the intensity. So actually you need to facilitate that by giving people more recovery. And I don't think there's a golden ratio of 1-to-1 or whatever, but you should be able to feel like you're not going to be fully recovered by your next rep, but you should feel like I'm ready to go. I can go and do this and get through it, and it's going to be hard, but I will be okay. If you're doing, and I'll give examples of poor session design, I would say would be 5 by a K off a minute rest, because it's not long enough to be a threshold session. So you want to be working pretty hard to get some good response out of that. But a minute rest is really going to hamper you in terms of being able to keep putting out the same pace across the whole session. So either I go, well, let's make it a threshold session. We're going to do 10 by a K off a minute, or we're going to make it an actual severe intensity domain session where you can really put a good amount of work in, and you're going to do 5 by a K off 2 to 3 minutes rest. Probably 2 is enough. I think if you're giving 3 minutes, if it's awful weather, you're just going to get cold. But 2 minutes is probably enough to enable you to feel like you've recovered, repleted your ATP levels a bit, have your myoglobin levels reoxygenated, and be able to give another good rep. So I think they're the two things I would say. Don't go too hard, but not too hard. Set a minimum intensity you want to go over rather than hit a maximum ceiling you want to try and get to, and give yourself the best chance of having a good session by giving yourself the necessary recovery. And also don't attempt these sessions if your body's not ready. If you're not ready, don't do it. If you're just not going to get those benefits, or the cost is going to be you end up injured, fatigued, overtrained, etc. So you need to respect these sessions because they are harder.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. Yeah. I guess it's also one where, like, during a threshold session, you probably don't. If you're having to extend the recovery, like, you're going too hard. Whereas, maybe especially the first couple of times you're trying these sessions, like, maybe you go from 2 minutes to 2.5 minutes, like, partway through the session, but it's not really the end of the world either. Just, I guess. Yeah, I think it's a takeaway in a lot of our podcasts, isn't it? Try something, don't be crazy ambitious, and then reflect on it, and slightly change something the next time, and see how it goes, and reflect on it again.
Yeah, it's definitely a learning process when you're trying a different type of training or a different intensity. It takes a while to learn how to really execute those sessions and ingrain that pacing system within your own head, and actually what does feel sustainable and what doesn't feel sustainable. Because I'm a little bit injured at the minute, so I've been doing stuff on the bike, and my perception of what I can sustain and what I can't sustain is nowhere near as well calibrated as it is for running. It's because I've not developed that over years and years. I've been on my bike on and off for my whole life, but it's not the same as running, where I know what threshold should feel like, and I know what if I could sustain this for 10 minutes or if I could sustain it for an hour. Whereas on a bike, it's just completely thrown off because my heart rate's super low, but my breathing is quite hard and my legs are on fire, and it's just not. I've not married up that input versus output association. But if you want to hear more about that, go and my injury woes and my maybe build to Seville marathon or not, then go check out Patreon, and we'll be talking about that at the back end of this week, and a new episode will come out every week, tracking all of our training as we build towards our various races.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end for today.
Yeah, nice short one, only an hour and 15 minutes. That's barely a easy run, right, isn't it?
Yeah, just the morning easy run.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks for listening. I hope you found this interesting. Give us feedback on in the comments, and yeah, check your. See you next week. Finally got it out of my words out of my mouth. See you next week.
Catch you next time.